Hey everyone, welcome to Sociastrology. Today we are going to look at the transit of Venus through Scorpio that we'll be experiencing for about 3 weeks or so. I do want to say off the bat, this week my schedule conflicted with doing the weekly forecast, but I wanted to bring this transit in particular to people's attention because I think it's a lot more significant than it looks like it is, both in terms of our personal lives and in terms of mundane astrology and global affairs. So we'll go through this one. I will also do a video shortly on this transit through the houses so that we can see where this is playing out in our charts, and in particular, certain aspect patterns that this Venus in Scorpio will be creating throughout this month for us, so that we can understand a little bit more how we can expect this to play out for ourselves. With all of that said, if you are new here, please do consider sticking around by subscribing for future videos. I would love to have you here. And if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up, I would really appreciate it. It does help me with the algorithm so much, so I very much appreciate that. It also indicates to me what kind of content that you guys enjoy and helps me to plan future videos based on that. So I very much appreciate all that feedback. And additionally, in terms of specific feedback, please do let me know if this screen is very bright on a phone to look at. I have gotten feedback about that with white background, so I'm hoping that this is dimmed down enough for it to not be too rough. But definitely let me know if it still is, and I can go for darker colors still. So with all of that said, let us dive in. So the most important thing to keep in mind with Venus in Scorpio is that it's in detriment or exile. I use both of those terms. Exile is actually probably more correct in terms of how the planet functions there. But the important thing to know is that Venus doesn't perform as usual here. It doesn't perform very comfortably here. It's not an environment that Venus is particularly suited to. Another thing to keep in mind as we're going through this is that we do have Venus as the evening star, so you may be able to see Venus just after sunset. I am sadly in an area with a lot of light pollution, so things like that are often not quite the case, but if you are able to see it, then it may be worth checking out in the evening once the sun is down below the horizon. So the relationship between Venus and Mars is unique to these signs that they rule. Venus rules Libra and Taurus here, and Mars rules Scorpio and Aries. And the relationship between them is that when they are in each other's signs, they are in exile or in detriment. So Venus in Scorpio is ruled by Mars, and Mars is also in a place that it's not comfortable. It's in its fall, which is to say, in Cancer, Mars is in the opposite sign to where it is exalted, where it functions best. So it functions also in an uncomfortable environment, similar to how Venus feels about Scorpio. Mars feels about Cancer. Another thing to keep in mind with regard to this transit is there's a couple aspect patterns that Venus will be making, but there's not a lot of other aspects that she'll be receiving. So these are mostly flowing aspects, but flowing, I definitely always want to remind, doesn't mean good. It just means frictionless. So she will have a Grand Trine formed with Saturn and Mars, and also a basket formation when she gets late in the degrees of Scorpio opposite to Uranus and Taurus. And then she will also be trine to Neptune in Pisces and sextile to Pluto in Capricorn. And I will treat those as aspect patterns rather than just as individual transits, because I think it gives a more full picture of what's actually going on and being experienced. Now, another thing that we just kind of lightly want to keep in mind is that Jupiter is also in detriment or exile. Jupiter is in Gemini right now. It is not necessarily a place that it would like to be. Jupiter likes to focus on big picture matters And Gemini is a detail oriented or detail focused, small things focused, day to day focused sign here. So Jupiter doesn't function optimally here, but maybe because I have Jupiter in Gemini personally, I feel like Jupiter functions a little bit better here than Venus necessarily would in Scorpio in a transit. I also should preface that what I'm about to say, which is mostly not good stuff, is not any sort of indictment on people who have Venus and Scorpio natally. It's definitely very different to experience something as a transit than it is to have it natally. So, with all of that said, let's move on here and look at some of the themes that we can see here. So, what we really want to keep in mind, again, with these planets in detriment, really with any planet in any sign, is that the planet is an archetype within the context of an archetypal environment. So when we look at Venus, Venus has to do with peace, it has to do with harmony, it has to do with loving relationships, with friends, with women, with beauty, with grace, with joy, with pleasure. All of these kinds of matters are Venusian themes. And Scorpio is rather the archetype of the scorpion. It is fierce, it is protective, it is even aggressive at times. It is considered relatively barren, even though it is a water sign. It can certainly get worked up and not necessarily in a way that is overtly seen, but it could be. But this could also work in the background, and it can be pretty fierce behind the scenes even. Again, no indictment on Scorpios or anything. This is just, it's the environment of the sign that a planet goes through. It's additionally rather probing. In terms of mundane astrology, or rather horary astrology, Scorpio would represent places that are considered kind of dark or not very pleasant, even like a little bit filthy. I always feel bad talking about signs this way because I feel like people are going to take it personally, but I really hope that you don't. It's just these are literally the associations of the sign in terms of environment. Now, Scorpio can also be extraordinarily private. That's a lot of that kind of working behind the scenes. And ruled by Mars, it would also be one of the archetypal war zones. And yet, not so much an Aries style, overt, in your face, very cut and dry, side against side kind of war zone. This is more of a kind of gripping and horrendous war zone because there is also a darkness to it in terms of the information coming out of it would probably also not be clean or clear or necessarily completely factually true because there could be a bit of a manipulation behind the scenes of the information that comes out. So we can see why Venus archetypally would not do well in this environment. There are planets like Mars that do very well in Scorpio, but certainly when I was first kind of considering, okay, this is a transit that's coming, I wasn't thrilled about it, mostly because Venus is moving on from Libra, where it has been just for a short time recently, and that's been pretty nice because she's been very, very comfortable in Libra and functions very, very well there. But when I started looking at this and how it's playing out, especially in terms of with Mars ruling it also from detriment, and then the fact that she's not really, even though she's making flowing aspects, she's not making the most pleasant of aspects. She's not receiving any accidental dignities that I'm aware of at all. You can correct me if I've overlooked something. I'm just kind of saying that off the cuff as something that I'm noticing now as well, is that she's not receiving any flowing aspect from Jupiter. She's not even receiving flowing aspects from the Sun or Mercury. She's mostly dealing with the malefics, Mars and Saturn, which can be more difficult planets, and neither of them are particularly comfortable right now. And then she will be in aspect to the outer planets, which are much more likely to impart their influence on Venus here than it is to be helpful in maybe the way that we would particularly want for it to. speaking of the themes of this, so the environment and the planet that's here is what we always want to try and keep in mind when we're considering transits of planets through signs. So Venus is representative of women, also children. So women and children in war. This is part of the reason why she doesn't do well here. That's not something that we consider to be particularly desirable. And of course, we can have our feelings about that and the history of that, but it's still not the greatest place for anyone, war. But certainly when we're talking women and children in war, we're usually talking non-combatants. And that is one way that this would potentially play out, is that there could be, especially considering we have wars going on, a major problem toward non-combatants during this period of time. And that's something that I am quite concerned about coming up. Additionally, we can get gaslighting. So Venus in Scorpio as a transit can kind of increase the likelihood, especially considering the connections that she's making, to emotional manipulation. So gaslighting and kind of fudging facts in a way to make them more along the lines of what one would want for them to be rather than necessarily what they factually are, you know? Additionally, Venus in Scorpio can really demand and need loyalty and control in social relationships, whether they be romantic or friends or family or within the context even of a workplace. The social relationships will be experienced as something that is demanding loyalty, and we do want to ask whether our loyalties to others are good for us, or whether they are controlling our own behavior to an extent that isn't necessarily healthy. Additionally, Venus represents the diplomat as well. And with her in this kind of exiled or weakened or uncomfortable state, we can have diplomacy compromised. I actually, just before I started recording this, also saw that, we'll just say BB to hopefully agitate the algorithm a little bit less, has just declared that there will not be any negotiations, any peace talks or anything for 45 days. And that is, one, ironic because it's until the day after the election. So clearly there's even some foreign election meddling in the US election through that choice of his, which is a kind of manipulative social relationship thing between our countries here, which is, of course, not the greatest. But additionally, it's throughout the Venus and Scorpio period and beyond a little bit. And I think that Venus in Sagittarius will be cleaning a little bit of this up, but we'll get to that in a moment. It's also laying the groundwork, I think, to make other countries and other regions in the area look more like Gaza than they currently do. And of course, we have a major, major women and children in war zone problem going on over there right now. So compromised diplomacy, likely he simply will not accept any sort of intervention from anyone. And that's going to be extraordinarily difficult, especially because where regards it, foreign interference in the election, the fact is that people have been waiting for an October surprise for him for some time because he clearly has a dog in the race. And so there's probably going to be, especially with this transit here, just no addressing of the situation in a way that makes any sense, because the party that he's against is too afraid to withhold anything from him during this time. So it's just a very, very compromised position here. And we can already see this playing out on the world stage. Even just the first day, I'm recording this on the 23rd, even just immediately in the first day that we have this transit. And I think that that's going to get worse. Again, we can have discriminate compassion with Venus and Scorpio. So Venus can, again, this is a form of emotional manipulation where you're being compassionate only to, one side of a situation and you're pushing that in a way that would be emotionally manipulative. So we can also have Schadenfreude with this as well, where there's this, oh, isn't it so terrible when the people that I like or agree with or align with are experiencing any sort of difficulty or something, but then really enjoying it when people on the other side, this being probably women and children, are suffering in an extreme way. This is also a very extreme alignment, is one thing that I didn't write down, but I did want to not forget, is that this alignment that we'll be seeing between Mars in Cancer and Venus in Scorpio here, it is quite extreme, and it will also be amplified really by an eclipse that we will also discuss within this context as well. So extreme ideas, extreme news, extreme stances, things like this are probably going to be something that comes up. We can also have a kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation going on with Venus, because Venus is friendship, but it is extraordinarily compromised, perhaps especially morally. And so that brings that theme in of, because we're talking war and enemies, with this being ruled by Mars here, then you can wind up in that kind of a situation that's not great. You know, this isn't, there's no way to really like candy coat. And I know that people get upset with me about this sometimes, but when there's a transit that shouldn't really be candy coated, I don't really want to be put in the position to have to candy coat it. Venus isn't comfortable here. That's just an unfortunate fact. And we're experiencing some of the same with Mars in Cancer here. So I just want to kind of remain clear-eyed about that. There's friends in war, but they're probably not going to be ones that are ultimately truly beneficial or true friends. Let's put it that way. So again, I don't like this transit during a time when we're toying with these questions of war. But additionally, with Venus also being relief efforts, these will probably also become much more difficult. Another thing, that I was seeing today was that there's a major difficulty of getting supply and relief in to Gaza because of this kind of extreme rain that they've been experiencing. And so it's muddy. And that's one thing that we can wind up with this placement as well between the water signs is matters getting muddied up. And we'll see that also in other contexts. Now, this Grand Trine, I've seen some people getting pretty positive about this, and power to them. Go for it. Be as positive as you want. I don't love it. From the moment that I've been seeing it, I don't love it, because Venus is in an uncomfortable position. And then she's in flowing connection to the two malefics. And Saturn isn't really the worst in Pisces, but it's certainly not thrilled. Fortunately, it's not the strongest Saturn. So even though it's not thrilled here, it can't, well, it probably could do some damage, but it wouldn't necessarily be super inclined to when it's in Pisces. It can have some level of compassion there, let's put it that way. But it's basically giving access to Venus, to Mars and Saturn simultaneously. And neither of them are that thrilled. Mars is in particular quite uncomfortable and ruling this Venus. So Mars is really in charge of this Venus. And that's part of why it's not just that Venus is in Scorpio that has me uncomfortable about this transit. And that's also, the way that I'm describing it is really Venus in Scorpio ruled by Mars in Cancer. That's where my concern really comes in with this. This isn't a standard Venus in Scorpio transit even. So with that said, this is a little bit too much access in my view. There's not a lot of friction, which means that there's not a lot that's getting in the way of these planets that are known to be troublesome to have access to this Venus that is already in a poor position. So again, this is where potentially a lot of manipulation comes in. This could definitely be some emotional manipulation where there are intentions behind the woe is me kind of message that could be coming through with this Venus of, oh, feel sorry for me, that is really untoward with these having access to this Venus here. Now, I do want to clarify, Mars also in detriment. What I mean by that is that it's in Cancer. It's not comfortable here. We already went through that. Saturn is peregrine. And what that means is, or peregrine, what that means is that it's in a position where it has no dignities, but it's also not debilitated. So it's just kind of considered to be a wandering planet. It's in a place that it's not particularly familiar with, but it doesn't hate it. So that's one thing that I do want to kind of point out here is, when it comes to Hellenistic or traditional astrology, as I try to really incorporate into my practice, because it offers some really good guardrails, and I feel a pretty level, steady head where I can't just look at this Venus and Scorpio the way that I would like to and say it's all going to be cool, is that there are no real accidental dignities here. What's actually kind of coming through is that could be said of Mars and Saturn, but they're also flowing to that Venus. And so it's a difficult situation. Now, on a personal level, some things that I see coming through with this particular aspect pattern, this Grand Trine between these three planets, is boundaries and codependency. When I first saw this, my thought was, ooh, okay, that looks codependent. But it could also be boundaries, because this could also become a little bit reclusive. So that may be something that you're inclined to do during this period of time, is be less social. And that might be wise considering the situation here. I'm not saying stay away from people, because obviously there are people out there that can definitely be trusted. But if that's what you're feeling, I would lean into that a little bit, maybe lay low for a while until this moves on, or until you're feeling a little bit more comfortable getting out. I wouldn't force yourself out if you're not feeling it, especially if you are particularly introverted or like people pleasing type of codependent person, because that is what that is, even though it's a kind thing. And that can lead to some poor boundaries. And again, with these planets having access to that, it's just kind of something to keep in mind, of maybe something that you don't want to really open up to, So we do want to make sure that those boundaries are intact, but that they are not necessarily stinging with the Scorpio energy here. Now, one thing that is productive, that you could choose to do with this, would be to work through emotional matters. But one thing that will probably be a little bit involuntary will be getting worked up about emotional matters. This is an emotionally pretty heavy and intense configuration here. And the whole time that Venus is in Scorpio, that will definitely be true. Perhaps particularly during these days, I just kind of chose it when these were closest, but during those days when this is the tightest Grand Trine, we do also have the moon in Scorpio, and that's going to be right in early October, just about a day after the eclipse. So this is going to be a pretty emotionally, potentially tense, but let's say emotionally laden time throughout this time, and even when that moves on, but this is particularly strong here. Another way that we can choose to proactively and productively express this is that this is excellent for creative work. So any sort of emotionally expressive or artistic or craft related or anything like that kind of work that you do that is enjoyable or expressive, or that you kind of emotionally connect to, that would be a wonderful way to offer this transit an outlet, and a productive, expressive outlet. One thing with transits that I tend to try to do is, if I see a difficult one coming up, I will try to plan ahead of time of, okay, this is how I know that I can express this transit productively. And hopefully by doing so, I can offer it an outlet so that it doesn't come through as strongly in any sort of negative ways that it potentially could if I were not actively working with the energy. So that's something that I definitely recommend doing, is any sort of artistic or creative or expressive work with this, so that it doesn't come through for you in a way that isn't quite comfortable. So again, as I said before, it feels like muddy waters are wading through. I'm praying that I'm wrong about this, but our energies might get dampened a bit with this alignment here. And it may be that unless we are kind of inspired to do something, it might feel a little bit more weighty, kind of like you're trekking through a pool, you know? So I do hope that I'm wrong about that. This is a pretty rare alignment. It won't necessarily happen all the time because you have to get all of these planets in place in order to have this lineup here. And then to have these two in detriment and this one peregrine so that none of them have any dignities. But that's kind of the sense of it that I'm getting, is that there is definitely a muddy waters situation going on here and a fog situation. So things aren't exactly as they're going to be seeming. But additionally, it may feel a little bit like wading through. And this transit of Venus through Scorpio is also taking place entirely throughout the season of these two Venusian eclipses that we've had. So we had our first eclipse was at 25 degrees of Pisces, and Venus exalts in Pisces. It definitely absolutely loves to be there. And then we are having that new moon eclipse on October 2nd in Libra, which is a sign that Venus rules. So these are two very Venus-oriented eclipses, but the one that is occurring on October 2nd will have Venus debilitated during that time. Venus was very strong when we had our first pretty Venusian, also Jupiterian eclipse in Pisces. So something to keep in mind is that this is going to be a very strong influence, especially because of that eclipse. Really both of them, but more so the latter. So additionally, we have this alignment here, and I have this set on 3-degree orbs. Pluto is also trine to Uranus, so that's something that we do want to keep in mind, is that there's another little blue line that goes like this, but in a much neater way there. So this is a basket formation, and it's something that we will see occur quite a bit in the coming years as planets hit specific places because of the fact that we have a minor Grand Trine. I think it was actually shown. Yeah, it's that trine is what we're not seeing on the other side, which we should be, but it's a little bit out of the tight orbs that I have here. So this minor Grand Trine is occurring over the course of the coming several years, on and off, mostly on. And so what that means is that any planet that hits across from it, opposite to one of those points, so opposite to Pluto over here, will create a basket. Opposite to Uranus here, over in Scorpio, where are we at here? Right over here, will also create a basket. So something to keep in mind, but that's going to be created there. So what these outer planets represent, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, right here, here, and here respectively, are broad global cultural matters, social matters. This is the broader world, more or less. These are really, really big energies that have a huge personal impact on us, but we don't have individual control over unless we kind of contain one of these energies by, for instance, being insanely powerful over society, or a huge cultural icon, or doing something totally crazy that captures the attention, you know? So as regular people, we tend to get influenced by this more than we do influence it, except as we, so to say, work as the masses. The masses also have influence over these planets, but it tends to be experienced in that kind of big social global matters kind of way. So that's what it's bringing to this Venus. And this Venus, I'm quite sure, is already going to be pretty, unfortunately, geopolitically active. And with it certainly in opposition to this Uranus, which has been super geopolitically and politically in the US active, where it's been major Uranus transits that occurred when the Trump first assassination attempt occurred. And it's kind of ongoing for him because it's a personal transit that's ridiculously huge for him right now. Additionally, Biden stepping down and things like this. So it's already quite politically active, and it's coming into opposition with this Venus. So with these big outer planets, these huge matters in the world, there could be a potential for overwhelming matters. So, for instance, even global affairs where we collectively don't really know how to respond to something, or we don't know if there is a way to respond to something, perhaps because of obstinance on the part of some party that's involved. Or, for instance, in the case of a natural disaster, sometimes it's just impossible to get to a place to offer relief or aid because of the conditions that are ongoing. Things like this, where it's not quite possible to respond the way that, your heart would have you want to. Additionally, with a peace planet in a war sign, these matters around war and peace get amplified onto the world stage when it's in contact with these planets in this very strong way as well. Could be shocking. And additionally, Venus is quite cultural as well. It's kind of on a lighter, more day-to-day scale, but with it in contact to Neptune, which rules, broadly speaking, all of the cultural trends and things like this in the wider world. We could have cultural values really come into focus around matters of war, around matters of women and children, around matters of sexuality, especially with Venus and Scorpio, and potentially, like I said, shocking events around this, or kind of shocking discourse publicly that we're kind of having to, again, wade through. So that may be a bit of the aspect of these might just be troubling matters that are kind of coming up that we don't really want to discuss. And that may be a lot of that kind of wading through it energy that I was picking up on with this transit as well, even in connection to these guys earlier. So questions around social power and how it's used also comes up here because, again, this can be a pretty powerful placement. Even natally, this is a powerful placement. It can have a huge influence, but influence can also lead to manipulation. And with it in connection to Pluto here, I don't love that. And there could be big cultural, global questions around power structures and how they're used and also kind of how they're manipulated. So, for instance, there's not a lot with this pointing to media, but that could be something that would come up because it would fit the theme of how power is used and how people are manipulated. And I'm also noticing this little embarrassing oversight. So we will pretend that this did not happen. It didn't happen. All right. So we also have potentially new fashions or cultural trends. Again, this connection to Neptune here, but they could also be considered somehow off-putting or strange. So Venus in Scorpio is known for being a little bit strange in terms of its fashion, but also with it in opposition to Uranus here, certainly that's amplified. And so we may see some things, some cultural trends, even something that's going viral that we're talking about. Some people may have very strong negative reactions to it because it's not normal, or it's very uncomfortable, or it's legitimately kind of not okay. So we've had some things like that kind of go viral too, where maybe there's some schadenfreude mixed into a cultural trend, for instance, and we tend to, most of us, not like that, so that could be something that could come up too. It's a little bit grotesque is kind of another word that I'm picking up on with this, is especially with the opposition to Uranus here, that could be something that could come up quite strongly. And I would think there may be like a sexual overtone to it, but again, it's going to be of a kind of grotesque orientation. And it would be so much more fun if this were happening during Halloween, but of course it's not, So let us erase that and move forward. So in terms of the eclipse, so this is occurring on October 2nd, at least in the Western Hemisphere. I don't know the exact time in the Eastern Hemisphere, if it's going to be on the 4th or not. But what we notice here, and I'll take you through this, is we've got a slew of fallen and exiled detriment planets. These planets are not comfortable. Who do we have that's even at all comfortable here? We have Mercury, borderline. Neptune's fine. That's kind of it, Otherwise, for the most part, the planets aren't in places that they love. So we have the sun in Libra is in its fall because it's opposite to its exaltation in Aries. So the sun doesn't love being here because Libra is very much focused on the other, and the sun should be self-oriented as far as the sun is concerned, but maybe the sun is a little bit of an egomaniac. Well, we don't know. So the sun is ruled by Venus, right? Because it's in Libra. And Venus is also exiled, and it's in Scorpio, ruled by Mars. And Mars is in its fall, and it's ruled by the moon. So the moon is going to be going around here and affecting the heck out of matters. Because also if we take, for instance, Mercury, pretty much the point that I will be making here, but I'll take us through it, but I want it to be clear so that you can follow me along, is that the moon has way too much power this month, which can be good. Obviously, you don't want to do any sort of moon magic necessarily with the planets all in these kind of like weird places, but it does give regular people kind of more access to ask questions, but it's also of the planets, for instance, asking favors and praying and so forth. But you're also more likely to get a no when you have all of these planets in bad moods here. So let me point that out. If we take Mercury, Mercury is in Libra, so it's ruled by Venus. Venus is ruled by Mars. So then Jupiter, which is also ruled by Mercury, is also leading back to the moon through Venus and Mars to the moon. The planets in Pisces are ruled by Jupiter. So they're going from Jupiter to Mercury and then back to Scorpio, or Venus in Scorpio, Mars in Cancer, and then to the moon. So the moon is dispositing just like all the planets right now. And so throughout this whole time that we have this alignment like this, we're going to have to look at the moon like crazy. We're going to have to watch those transits pretty closely throughout this period of time, because as it starts to trigger these planets, it's going to start to put things in motion, and things can develop very quickly and can snowball and can dissipate just as quickly when we are relying fully on the moon to resolve matters, because that's what a dispositor does, is that's where the resolution comes in. So there could be really more influence by regular people than necessarily as usual, because the moon is our satellite. The moon is our connection to all of the other planets. And the moon, more than any other planet, because it's just ours, it is earthling moon, is much more responsive to regular people, to human beings, to human affairs. And so because everything is resolving back to that, there is a little bit more control among people. But will it be exercised that way when we have like all of our significations in these places where they're not functioning well? So we may be pretty dependent on people who are either not able to or are saying no to our appeals to correct situations, to make situations more comfortable, because all of these planets are so oriented to say no. And we also want to watch for those trigger points with the moon, because that can be a timing thing. And especially around this eclipse, when we also have the timing influence of the nodes here, the moon's nodes, we're having that eclipse obviously on that node, because that's when we have eclipses. And this will probably be a bigger eclipse than it necessarily looks like. Additionally, this is in a square formation here to Mars. Not wonderful stuff. I don't love this. But one thing that we will see with that, again, with everything also then coming back to the moon, and then with this big question around the eclipse, is that social matters and relationships will become very important. Also, matters of women will become very important with the outsized influence of the moon here, as well as a kind of concern and a connection to Venus here. These planets being ruled by Venus, there's a lot of attention here, especially around women, so relationships to women and so on and so forth. But our relationships in general can take on an increased depth or can be challenged with this because we have both Mars and Venus in a bad mood. Now, thank gosh, they're not square to each other at any point through this, but even with a flowing aspect, that could still be a difficulty or a challenge that needs to be resolved. And additionally, what I want to point out about this eclipse is that because this eclipse is ruled by Venus, this transit is sticking with us for some months here. This snapshot in particular of the sky, again, this is only 3 degrees, so there's more aspects going on here, especially that square to the eclipse, which is not really being touched by anything else, which is a little bit unfortunate here. But this is something that we will be carrying with us for some months, especially the impact of it. So if we see something flare up around the eclipse, I would not expect for that in particular to dissipate quite as quickly. I would actually expect something that flares up around the eclipse to stick with us for a little while. Unfortunately, especially because of the fact that there is a lot of eclipse season that this is occurring in. Kind of toward the end, we might experience some more things that if it looks like a huge thing, it might dissipate. It's just going to be the more kind of cultural, slightly more lighthearted matters that are going to come up and then go away. But there probably will be some pretty hugely significant event around this eclipse that has a very underhanded Martian quality to it because of the fact that it's ruled by this Venus, which is in this Mars place, ruled by Mars, but it's also only really in contact with Mars. And then this completely, really kind of ineffectual Mercury here, which is totally combust from the sun. It's too close to the sun to be seen, so it doesn't really have much control at all. With all of that said, generally speaking, just to kind of sum it up, this Venus and Scorpio transit, I don't love it. It's bad on matters of war. These are kind of dangerous, perilous times. I'm hoping beyond hope because we have at least one completely, out of his mind right now, world leader right now that is being very warmongering. I don't have a lot of faith that he won't go crazy, but maybe somehow if that can be held back until after the eclipse, then maybe it could be a little bit less impactful. But this could also play out in other war-like situations. We could also see, in general, in our societies, more violence than usual. So in the US, especially because we tend to experience this on a scale that other countries tend not to when it comes to self-inflicted problems. But we could even see, weapons being used by people on other people a lot more than usual throughout the world. And perhaps, especially in an especially atrocious way toward women and children. Now, in terms of personal relationships, it's interesting. I'm not thrilled with it, but it works, is one thing that I will say. There can be conversations. There will be a yes to having a conversation. Whether or not you're going to get what you want out of the conversation is a different question. But one thing that I would try to be sure of in any relationships is that there is an equality of expectation. Again, remember that kind of emotional manipulation that I was alluding to? This can be a Venus that demands more than it would at all even consider giving. So this is something that we want to make sure we're not getting involved in, is something where one party is expecting to receive without giving on the same level, or is utilizing giving to control someone. So it's just something we want to keep in mind, and that just kind of generally falling into manipulation. Definitely don't manipulate others, but do try and keep your eye open to see if you're feeling a little weird about something, if you're feeling like you're being put in a position where you're like obligated to do something for someone and you can't quite put your finger on why, that should be a major red flag in this period of time, because that's that kind of behind the curtain working, under the radar kind of stuff that this transit could definitely indicate. And yet, on the other hand, this can also be a pretty self-sufficient transit if we want it to be, because of the fact that if you spend some time thinking about your boundaries and what it is that you want and don't want, you can become quite clear on what you're comfortable with and what you're not. So that may be, pardon, one of the ways that we want to try and actively utilize this transit. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that emotions are running high. Again, everything is going to the moon right now. The moon is really controlling a lot of stuff. So again, even when I was referring to things can come up quickly and then dissipate just as quickly, even emotions. So again, really watch out for reactions and resentments. That's one thing that I was pointing out when I covered Mars and Cancer generally. Let's add on to that this level of Venus and Scorpio. Watch out for reactions and resentments. Let's throw another level on that with the fact that everything's going to the moon right now. That's one thing that we absolutely have to try and keep track of. And I would also really avoid people who are being irrational because it could blow up in a way that you would not necessarily expect for it to. And we may even, because I'm saying that, I'm now kind of thinking that also when we get the Aries full moon, which is going to be close to an eclipse, it's like if it were a degree or two to the other side, then it would have taken on just the slightest eclipse bit. So it's just barely outside the region. And that one we may really want to watch out for because, again, then that moon is again in mutual reception with this Mars. And it's in an environment that is considered war like, if we were to give it a type of archetype, right? And people who are irrational, that's what I was kind of alluding to, where I was like, if someone seems like they might freak out, they might freak out. That's something that tends to happen with full moons anyway. So that Aries full moon is something that we're going to really want to watch out for. So that is what I have for this video. I will do another where I take this through the houses, but I really wanted to address this. I think it's a lot more impactful than it looks like it is on first glance, and I don't love it, but we'll get through it. It's 3 weeks, hopefully. If we can avoid having anything from this, really stick with that eclipse. But yeah, so again, if you did like this video, or if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, that helps me out so much with the algorithm. It helps the channel to grow, which I really, really appreciate. And do feel free to stick around by subscribing for future videos. If you would like to share this video, then do feel free. I really appreciate that. And do let me know how you're feeling about this transit. If you feel so inclined, I do love to read your comments. I read them all. And if you would like to book a reading, there is information in the description box about how to do that. And other than that, I hope you have a beautiful time, and I will see you very shortly in another video. Be good. Bye.